The candles were already weeping. Hundreds of them, lined along the stone pillars of the great hall of Ghostfang Keep, their golden tears pooling at the base like the grief no one dared speak aloud. The air smelled of jasmine and burning cedar, of promises that had been rehearsed and polished until they gleamed like the silver crowns resting on velvet cushions at the altar. Every noble house in the realm had gathered. Every lord and lady wore their finest silks. Every eye in the kingdom was fixed upon the altar where the mating bond was to be sealed in blood and moonlight, as it had been done for 1,000 years. And at the center of it all stood Pryden Ghostfang, Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, leaning on a pair of iron-forged crutches, his jaw set like a blade against the world. He was enormous, even diminished, even wounded, even standing with the support of metal where his legs had once carried him like a storm across battlefields. Pryden Ghostfang was the kind of man who made rooms feel smaller, simply by entering them. His shoulders were broad enough to carry the weight of a kingdom, and they had for 7 brutal years since the war that had shattered his left leg and torn the ligaments of his right knee beyond any healer's art. His black hair fell past his shoulders in heavy waves, catching the candlelight like ink spilled across silk. His beard was thick and dark, trimmed close to his jaw, framing a face that had been carved by suffering and hardened by command. His eyes were the gray of winter storms, and they burned now with something far worse than anger. They burned with the knowledge of what was about to happen. Lady Thessera Velmorn stood across from him at the altar, her golden gown catching the light like a second skin. She was beautiful in the way that weapons are beautiful, all edges and gleaming surface and no warmth beneath. Her lips were painted the color of crushed berries, and they were trembling, not with emotion, with revulsion. The high priest raised his hands. The hall fell silent. A silence so deep it felt like drowning. Lady Thessera Velmorn, the high priest intoned, his voice ancient and resonant. Do you accept the bond of the Alpha King? Do you offer your throat and your soul to this union, as the moon commands and the old blood demands? The silence stretched. It pulled at the edges of the room like a bowstring drawn too tight. Every noble held their breath. Every servant pressed themselves against the walls. The candles flickered as if even the flames were afraid. Thessera looked at Pryden. She looked at his crutches. She looked at the way his knuckles whitened around the handles, the way his massive body was held upright by nothing but will and iron. She looked at the most powerful man in the realm, and she saw only the broken parts. No. The word fell like a guillotine. A gasp tore through the great hall, a collective inhale that seemed to steal all the air from the room. Somewhere to the left, a glass shattered against the floor. A woman in the 3rd row pressed her hand to her mouth. Thessera lifted her chin. Her eyes were cold and dry. I will not bind myself to a man who cannot walk without aid. I will not bear the pups of a crippled king. The Velmorn line deserves strength, not this spectacle. She said the word spectacle as if she were spitting out something rotten. Pryden did not move. He did not flinch. His expression remained as still and unreadable as a frozen lake, but beneath the surface, something cracked. Something deep and old and tired finally gave way, like ice breaking over a river that had been frozen for too long. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Thessera turned on her heel, her golden skirts hissing against the stone floor, and walked down the center aisle. Her family followed, Lord Velmorn's face a mask of political calculation. The doors of the great hall opened and closed. The sound echoed like a coffin lid. And then there was nothing but the candlelight, and the silence, and the Alpha King standing alone at an altar where no one wanted him. The nobles began to murmur. It was the low, insidious hum of pity and judgment, of whispered calculations about succession and weakness. Some looked at him with genuine sorrow. Most looked at him the way one looks at a wounded animal, wondering whether it would be kinder to put it down. Pryden's personal guard, Commander Drevin, stepped forward. "My king, let me escort you to your chambers. "Leave me." The words came out low and rough, like stones dragged across gravel. He turned, slowly, painfully, the crutches clicking against the stone with a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march, and made his way to the far corner of the great hall, near the tall arched windows where the moonlight spilled in like liquid silver. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube, extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. He stood there, alone, his back to the room, his silhouette massive and broken against the glass. The moonlight caught the tears he would never let anyone see. Within the hour, the great hall was nearly empty. The servants moved like ghosts, clearing plates and extinguishing candles, their eyes carefully averted from the king. Among them was a girl. She was young, perhaps 22, though her eyes carried the weight of someone who had known hardship since childhood. Her skin was pale as fresh snow, almost luminous in the dying candlelight, and her hair was white, not silver or blonde, but truly white, falling in soft waves past her shoulders, like threads of moonlight woven into silk. She wore a simple red dress, the color of embers, the only bright thing left in that fading hall. Against her white skin and white hair, it made her look like a flame walking through snow. Her name was Cyrilda Emberfield, and she was nobody, an Omega, a servant. One of the dozens who kept the Ghostfang keep running, who scrubbed the floors and carried the linens and poured the wine and lived their lives in the margins of other people's stories. She had been orphaned at 7, taken in by the keep's head housekeeper, and had grown up knowing exactly what she was in the eyes of the world: invisible. But Cyrilda had never felt invisible inside, where a quiet fire burned that no amount of cold stone floors or dismissive glances could extinguish. She felt everything deeply. She noticed things. The way the head cook's hands shook when she was worried about her son. The way the stable boy hummed the same lullaby his dead mother used to sing. The way the kingdom ached beneath its glittering surface. And tonight, she noticed the king. She had always noticed the king. She knew that he took his tea without sugar, but with a single drop of honey. She knew that he read late into the night, choosing books about history and philosophy and sometimes poetry, never about war. She knew that when he thought no one was watching, he would look out at the mountains with an expression that was deeply, achingly lonely. She knew that he was kind. Not kind in the way that nobles are kind, with calculated generosity. Kind in the small, invisible ways. He remembered the names of every servant. He had once ordered the royal healer to attend to a kitchen girl who had burned her hand, delaying his own council meeting. He never raised his voice to the people who served him, not once. And now he was standing alone in the moonlight, abandoned at his own altar, and the entire world was pretending they did not see him. Cyrilda set down the tray of empty goblets she was carrying. Something was pulling at her chest, a thread of warmth that connected her heartbeat to the sight of that massive, solitary figure by the window. It was not pity. Pity was what the nobles felt, that distant, self-congratulatory sadness that cost nothing. What Cyrilda felt was something fiercer, something that made her want to close the distance and stand in the darkness with him, simply so he would know that the darkness did not have to be faced alone. She was terrified. An Omega servant did not approach the Alpha King uninvited. It was not done. She could be dismissed, punished, sent away from the only home she had ever known. but he was alone. And she could not bear it. Her feet carried her forward. The red dress whispered against the stone floor. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. She stopped 3 paces behind him. "Your Majesty?" Her voice was soft, barely more than a breath. But in the silence of that empty hall, it landed like a petal on still water, sending ripples in every direction. Pryden did not turn immediately. She saw his shoulders tense. He was bracing himself, she realized. Bracing for more pity, more careful, empty words. When he finally turned his head, just enough to see her over his shoulder, his gray eyes were guarded and raw. He saw a girl in a red dress, white hair that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and eyes, large and luminous, that were looking at him with an expression he could not identify because he had never seen it directed at him before. She was not looking at his crutches. She was not looking at the crown or the kingdom or the political implications of his humiliation. She was looking at him, just him. Cyrilda swallowed hard and let the fire inside her carry her. "Shall we dance?" 3 words. 3 impossible, ridiculous, beautiful words that hung in the air between them like stars. Pryden stared at her. For 3 full heartbeats, he simply stared. And Cyrilda was certain she had made the most catastrophic mistake of her life. But then something shifted in those gray storm eyes. The ice cracked, not with violence, but with the gentleness of spring thaw, and beneath it, she caught a glimpse of something warm and achingly human. "Dance?" he repeated, his voice rough but not unkind. "I cannot dance. Surely you can see that." He gestured at the crutches with a bitterness directed at himself, not at her. Cyrilda held his gaze with a steadiness that surprised them both. "I have 2 left feet and no sense of rhythm, Your Majesty. I think we would be perfectly matched." A sound escaped him. Small, barely more than an exhale, but it carried the ghost of something that might have been laughter. The first sound resembling laughter that Pryden Ghostfang had made in months. "You are either very brave or very foolish," he said. "I have been told they are the same thing, Your Majesty." He looked at her for another long moment. The moonlight painted them both in silver and shadow. The enormous Alpha King with his iron crutches, and the slender Omega girl in her ember dress. 2 people standing on opposite sides of every divide the world had ever created, and yet somehow standing on exactly the same ground. "There is no music," he said quietly. Cyrilda tilted her head. And then, very softly, she began to hum. It was a melody she had known since childhood, a folk song from the outer villages about 2 stars that fell from the sky and found each other in a field of snow. It was simple and sweet and slightly melancholy, the kind of music that belonged to kitchens and hearths, not to grand halls. It was common music, poor music. It was the most beautiful thing Pryden had ever heard. He extended one hand, large and scarred and trembling almost imperceptibly, and Cyrilda took it. Her hand was small in his, warm. Her fingers curled around his palm with a gentleness that made something behind his ribs tighten and release at the same time. She stepped closer, and the scent of her reached him, clean linen and wildflowers and something uniquely hers, a sweetness that made his wolf stir for the first time in years, not with aggression, but with a yearning so profound it felt like homesickness. They began to move. It was not graceful. It was halting and awkward and imperfect in every conceivable way. Pryden could not take a full step without his crutch, and his body swayed unevenly. Cyrilda matched him, adjusting her movements, shortening her steps, her humming never faltering even when they stumbled. And they did stumble. Once, his crutch slipped on the polished stone, and he lurched sideways, and for one terrible instant, he was certain he would fall. But Cyrilda's hand tightened on his, and her other hand came up to press against his chest, steadying him. "I have you," she whispered. and he believed her. They danced. It was more like two people learning the shape of each other's gravity, finding the places where they could lean and be held, where they could falter and be caught. The great hall was empty around them, vast and echoing with the ghosts of the evening's disaster. But in the small circle of moonlight where they moved, none of it mattered. The rejection did not matter. The crutches did not matter. None of it could reach them here. Pryden looked down at this impossible, reckless, radiant girl, and felt something crack open inside him that he had sealed shut years ago. She was smiling. Not a polished, practiced smile, but a real one, slightly crooked. Her dark eyes bright with something so much more dangerous than pity. Joy. She was genuinely, luminously happy. "You are a strange girl," he murmured, and the roughness of his voice had softened into something almost tender. "So I have been told, Your Majesty." "Pryden," she blinked up at him. "I beg your pardon?" "My name. It is Pryden. If we are going to dance like fools in an empty hall, you might as well use it." Another flush climbed her cheeks, but the smile widened. "Pryden," she repeated, as if tasting the word, and he had never heard his own name sound like that before, like it was something warm and precious and carefully held. They danced until the last candle guttered and died. They danced until the moon had moved halfway across the sky. They danced until Cyrilda's humming faded into a comfortable silence that needed no music, because the rhythm of their breathing had become its own kind of song. When at last they stopped, Pryden was breathing hard, not from exertion but from the effort of containing everything he was feeling. His hand was still holding hers. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out raw and unguarded, stripped of every layer of kingly composure. "For being kind to me tonight." Cyrilda looked up at him with no calculation, no agenda, no awareness of the chasm between them. She saw only a man who had been hurt, and she had come to stand beside him. "You deserve kindness, Pryden," she said softly. "Everyone does, but you especially." She released his hand gently, dropped a small curtsy, and turned to leave. The red dress moved like a whisper of flame in the darkness, and Pryden watched her go with the sensation of a man watching the sunset, knowing the warmth would linger on his skin, but already aching for dawn. The servants' quarters were cold. They were always cold. Tucked into the lower levels of the keep, where the stone walls sweated with damp, and the windows were too narrow to admit more than a sliver of light, the rooms were functional and sparse. Cyrilda's room was no different, except for the small collection of dried wildflowers she kept in a chipped clay cup on the windowsill, a tiny act of rebellion against the gray uniformity of her world. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, still in her red dress, her hands pressed flat against her thighs, as if trying to keep them from shaking. Her heart had not slowed. She had danced with the king. She had taken the hand of Pryden Ghostfang, Alpha of Alphas, Lord of the Northern Dominion, and she had danced with him in an empty hall. And he had let her, and he had smiled, and he had told her his name. A sound escaped her that was half laugh and half something wet and trembling. She was not crying. There was nothing to cry about. She had done a kind thing for a man who needed kindness, and that was all. Except it was not all. When he had looked at her, when those gray eyes had softened from guarded stone to something liquid and warm, when his enormous scarred hand had closed around hers with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so powerful, Cyrilda had felt something she had no language for. It was the feeling of a key sliding into a lock it was made for, the soft, certain click of something fitting into place. She pressed her hand to her chest, where the sensation still lingered. "Stop it," she told herself firmly, speaking aloud in the way that lonely people do. "He is the king. You are a servant. This is not a story." But even as she said the words, she could feel the lie in them, thin and transparent as tissue, already tearing. She blew out her candle and lay in the darkness. And behind her closed eyes, she saw gray storms and felt the weight of a scarred hand holding hers. And she fell asleep with the ghost of a melody on her lips. 3 floors above, in the royal chambers, Pryden Ghostfang sat in the darkness and could not sleep. The fire had burned low, reduced to glowing coals that cast the room in shades of amber and shadow. His ruined legs stretched before him, the crutches leaning against the bedpost like sentinels. The pain was constant, a deep, grinding ache. And tonight, it was particularly sharp. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, the pain was not the loudest thing in his mind. She had asked him to dance. He turned the memory over and over like a stone polished by river water. The softness of her voice, the flush of her cheeks, the way her eyes had looked at him, not with political assessment or fearful deference, but with something unguarded that said, "I see you." Not the king, not the warrior, not the ruin. You. The marriage to Thesara had been a political arrangement from the start, a strategic alliance designed to consolidate power in the northern territories. Pryden had never loved Thesara. He had never even liked her. She was sharp and cold and calculating. He had agreed because it was his duty, because the kingdom needed stability, because his council had insisted, and he had been too worn down to resist. But what he had felt tonight, standing in the moonlight with a servant girl's hand in his, that was something else entirely. That was something he had never felt. Not with Thesara. Not with anyone. It was the feeling of being seen, of being chosen, not as a king or an alpha or a political asset, but as a man. "Cyrilda," he said into the empty room, testing the shape of her name on his tongue. It tasted like honey. A decision began to form inside him, slow and certain and immovable as the mountains. It was not a rational decision. It was not a political decision. It was the kind of decision that comes from somewhere deeper than thought. He would make her love him, not through command, not through power. He would earn her, through patience and tenderness, and the slow, careful revelation of the heart he had kept hidden behind walls of duty and stoicism for so long that he had almost forgotten it was there. He did not care what the council would say. He did not care that she was an omega, a servant, a girl without name or land. In the calculus of his heart, she was already worth more than every political alliance in the realm. The fire died, the room went dark, and the Alpha King finally slept, and for the first time in years, he did not dream of war. Morning came to Ghostfang, keep gray and gradual. Cyrilda moved through her duties like a sleepwalker, her body performing familiar routines while her mind circled endlessly around the events of the previous night. It was mid-morning when the summons came. A page found her in the linen closet and delivered the message with breathless formality. "The king requests your assistance in his study. Something about the arrangement of his bookshelves." Cyrilda's heart stopped, restarted, began to beat at twice its normal speed. "The bookshelves," she repeated. "Yes. He said specifically that you are to come, not anyone else." The walk to the king's study was the longest of her life. She smoothed her red dress and told herself very firmly that she was a servant, answering a summons, and there was nothing extraordinary about it. She was a terrible liar, even to herself. She knocked. "Enter." The study was warm. A fire blazed in the hearth, filling the room with the scent of applewood. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, and beside the desk, standing with the aid of his crutches, his black hair loose around his shoulders and his gray eyes catching the flames, was Pryden. He looked different in daylight, less like a monument and more like a man. The lines of fatigue around his eyes were visible, and the pain was there, a constant undercurrent. But there was something else, a warmth that softened his face when he saw her. "Cyrilda." The way he said her name, as if it were a small, precious object he was turning carefully in his hands. Your Majesty, you wished me to arrange your bookshelves. A pause. She caught the flicker of something in his expression, a flash of guilt blended with amusement, and she realized with a jolt of insight that nearly made her laugh. There was nothing wrong with his bookshelves. Yes, he said, carefully neutral. The eastern wall. The volumes are in disarray. She looked at the eastern wall. The books were arranged in flawless alphabetical order by author, then subdivided by subject matter, a system so meticulous it bordered on obsessive. I see, she said, and Pryden's jaw tightened, and a faint color rose above his beard. It may not be immediately apparent to an untrained eye. Of course, Your Majesty. She moved to the shelves and began rearranging books that did not need rearranging. Behind her, she heard the slow thud of his crutches as he moved to the armchair by the fire. Did you sleep well? He asked, and the question was so ordinary, so domestic, so utterly unlike anything a king had ever asked a servant, that she nearly dropped the book she was holding. Yes, did you? Better than I have in a long time. He was watching her from the armchair, with an unguarded expression that made her breath catch. In the firelight, with his dark hair and his gray eyes gone soft as smoke, he looked like a painting of some ancient hero at rest. I wanted to thank you again, he said, for last night. You already thanked me, and I will thank you as many times as I wish. It is my prerogative as king. A smile tugged at her mouth. I would not dream of contradicting the king's prerogative. He smiled then too, and it transformed his face completely, broke through the severity and the suffering, like sunlight through storm clouds. He was beautiful when he smiled, not in the polished way of court favorites, but in the way that mountains are beautiful, with depth and shadow and grandeur inseparable from its roughness. She wanted to make him smile again. She wanted to spend the rest of her life finding ways. They talked. It began with the books and expanded into philosophy and literature, and Cyrilda discovered that the king was not only well-read, but passionate about ideas. When she offered a counter-argument, quoting a passage from a text she had secretly borrowed from the keep's library years ago, his eyes widened with surprise and then narrowed with delight. You have read Alderon's Meditations? He said. I am a servant, not illiterate. Forgive the assumption. Tell me what you thought of the 3rd chapter. And she did. And he listened, really listened, and Cyrilda felt something inside her expand. A space she had not known was cramped suddenly filling with light. 2 hours passed. Cyrilda realized with a start that she had neglected every other duty. I should go, she said. The head housekeeper will notice my absence. Disappointment flickered across his face. Of course. It was lovely, she said, and the word hung between them, fragile and luminous. Tomorrow the accounts ledger in my study requires attention, he said. I find myself in need of someone with a careful eye. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire crackled. I will be here, she said, and she was. The days that followed took on a pattern, a secret architecture of stolen time that neither acknowledged directly, but both maintained with unspoken devotion. Pryden invented reasons. He was remarkably creative about it. The bookshelves needed reorganizing again. The curtains let in too much light. He required someone to read aloud to him while his eyes rested. A fabrication so transparent that Cyrilda had to bite her cheek to keep from laughing, since his eyesight was flawless, and they both knew it. On the 4th day, it was the maps. These maps are outdated. I need someone to help me cross-reference them with the current survey reports. Do you not have cartographers for this? They are busy. All of them? Every single one. A remarkable coincidence. She stayed. It was during the map project that their hands touched. Accidental, a shared reach for the same inkwell, the contact brief. But Cyrilda felt it like a bolt of lightning, and when she looked up, she saw the same shock reflected in Pryden's eyes. He did not pull away. Neither did she. "Your hands are cold," he said softly. "They are always cold. The servants' quarters are not well heated." Something dark passed across his face. "I will have that seen to." "Pryden, you do not need to." "I will have it seen to," he repeated, and his voice carried the quiet finality of a man accustomed to command, but the tenderness in it was entirely new, entirely hers. On the 7th day, he asked her to walk with him. It cost him everything. Walking was Pryden's greatest vulnerability. Every step required the crutches, the careful negotiation with pain, and in public, he held himself with such rigid dignity that no one dared comment. But in private, his face showed every ounce of effort, every flash of pain. He was offering to show her that, to be vulnerable, to let her see the man behind the crown, with all his fractures exposed. They walked the private gardens, a walled enclosure of ancient trees and stone paths. The autumn air was crisp, scented with fallen leaves and the last roses. Pryden moved slowly, and Cyrilda walked beside him, matching his pace without comment, as if this was simply the speed at which two people enjoying each other's company chose to travel. "You never ask about it," he said abruptly. "About what?" "My legs. The war. What happened?" "It is not my place." "It is not anyone's place, and yet everyone asks. Or worse, they do not ask, but they stare, and their silence says more than any question." She watched a leaf spiral down from an oak branch. "I did not ask because I did not think you would want me to, and because it does not change who you are." He stopped walking. The crutches went still. "Say that again," he whispered. "It does not change who you are." He closed his eyes. A muscle in his jaw worked. When he opened them again, they were bright. "No one has ever said that to me. In 7 years, not once." Cyrilda felt her own eyes sting. She reached out and placed her hand over his where it gripped the crutch, and his fingers loosened beneath her touch. "Then the people around you have not been looking properly," she said. They stood like that in the autumn garden, her hand over his, the wind stirring the last leaves, and something between them shifted from possibility to inevitability, from two people who might fall to two people who already had. The council noticed. Of course they noticed. The Royal Council of Ghostfang Keep was comprised of 7 men who had risen to their positions through political acuity, family connections, and sharp-eyed observation of every whisper within the keep's walls. They were men who traded in information, and the sight of the Alpha King spending hours each day with an Omega servant set their teeth on edge. Lord Aldrich Brenshaw was the first to speak. He was the eldest, a thin, angular man with a silver beard and eyes like a hawk, a man who had served 3 kings and considered the Ghostfang dynasty a personal responsibility. "It has been 2 weeks since the Velmorn rejection," he said, addressing the others around the long table, "and the king has been seen repeatedly in the company of a serving girl." Lord Merrick Ashford, the youngest councillor, shifted uncomfortably. "She has been assisting him with administrative tasks. The Alpha King, who refused to take meals with Lady Thessara during their entire courtship, is now spending 4 hours a day with a girl who folds his linens. This is not nothing." Lord Voss Ironmere, the war minister, a man shaped like a barrel with fists like sledgehammers, leaned forward. "Let the king have his distraction." "A distraction, yes," Lord Brenshaw said coldly. "But this is the behavior of a man who is falling." The word hung in the air like smoke. "For an Omega, a servant. A girl without family, without lands, without a single drop of noble blood. A girl who is not fit to sit at the king's table, much less stand at his side." "We should speak to him," Lord Ashford said. "We should forbid it," Lord Ironmere countered. Lord Brenshaw shook his head. We cannot forbid a king, but we can remind him of his duty. The summons came to Pryden the following morning. He read the formal request for an emergency council session, and the warmth that had been building in his chest turned to ice. Not because he was afraid of his council, but because he knew exactly what this was about, and the knowledge filled him with a protective rage so intense that his wolf surged against his ribs like a caged beast. They were going to talk about her. He dressed for battle. He wore black, the color of the Ghostfang house. He bound his hair back. He looked in the mirror and saw what the world saw, an alpha of terrifying physical presence, scarred and dark and burning with controlled fury that made strong men step backward. Good. The council chamber was cold. The 7 counselors rose when Pryden entered, the sound of his crutches preceding him like a war drum. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table, towering over them, his gray eyes moving from face to face with the assessment of a predator. Speak, he said. Lord Brenshaw spoke with polished diction, every sentence designed to sound reasonable. Your Majesty, we must express our concern that this association may be perceived as weakness at a time when the kingdom requires strength. Lord Ironmere was less diplomatic. She is a common servant. The people will not accept her. To elevate a girl who scrubs floors to the position of Alpha Queen would be an insult to every family in the realm. Lord Ashford attempted mediation. We do not question your feelings, Majesty. We question the wisdom of allowing them to override the needs of the kingdom. And it was Lord Brenshaw who delivered the final blow. She is beneath you, Majesty, in every way that matters. She is a servant, a nobody, and to let her bewitch you into forgetting your duty is to prove that the Velmorn girl was right to... He did not finish. Pryden's fist hit the table with the force of a battering ram. The wood cracked, a split running down the center of the ancient oak, like a bolt of lightning through earth. Ink pots toppled, papers scattered. Lord Ashford flinched so violently his chair tipped. The room filled with the Alpha King's scent, the overpowering wave of an alpha at the peak of his fury, the protective rage of a man whose mate had been threatened. Every Omega and Beta in the keep felt it, a pressure that made hearts race and hands tremble, a reminder that beneath the crown and the crutches was a wolf that could still tear worlds apart. Enough. Pryden's voice was barely above a whisper, and it was more terrifying than any shout. You will listen to me now, and you will listen well, because I will say this only once. He looked at each of them in turn, and in his eyes was a fire that no one had seen since the day he had held the walls of Ashenmoor against an army of 10,000. Cyrilda Emberfield has more grace, more courage, and more genuine nobility in her smallest finger than every noble house in this kingdom combined. She came to me when every person in this realm turned away. She looked at me, not my crutches, not my crown, me, and she saw a man worth dancing with. His voice cracked on the last word, and for one shattering moment, the mask slipped, and they saw the loneliness. The years of it. The vast, howling emptiness of being surrounded by people who needed things from him, and not one, not a single one, had ever simply seen a man who needed to be loved. He gathered himself. The mask returned, harder than before. I am going to marry her, and if any man in this room, or in this kingdom, dares to speak ill of her, dares to make her feel for one instant that she is less than the extraordinary woman she is, I will consider it a personal affront to the crown. The silence that followed was the silence of men who knew exactly what a personal affront to the crown meant. He turned, his crutches striking the stone with the rhythm of finality, and left without looking back. The door closed behind him with a sound that echoed through the keep, like the first note of a new song. That evening, Pryden sent for Cyrilda, not to his study, but to the private garden. The autumn evening was cool, the last light painting the sky in amber and violet. She came wearing her red dress. He was waiting on the stone bench beneath the old oak, his expression a mixture of determination and something more vulnerable. something that looked very much like fear. "You summoned me," she said. "Sit with me." She sat close enough to feel the furnace heat of an alpha that burned hotter than any fire. "The council held a session today," Pryden said. "About us." Her breath caught. "About us?" "They told me to let you go. They told me you are beneath me, that you are a servant and a nobody, and that to care for you is a weakness." The words landed like blows, a cold tide of reality she had been trying to ignore. Of course this was how it ended. "And what did you tell them?" she whispered. Pryden reached out and took her hand, gently, with the reverent care with which one handles something irreplaceable. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and rough and steady. "I told them I am going to marry you." The garden went silent. Even the wind held its breath. Cyrilda stared at him. The meaning was impossible. The kind of thing that happened in the stories she had read by candlelight in her cold little room. Stories she had cherished and then tucked away with the bitter knowledge that they were only stories. "I know what I am asking is extraordinary," he said, his hand tightening. "I know the world will not understand. But I have spent 7 years being the king that this kingdom needs, and not once has anyone asked what I need. Until you walked across an empty hall in your red dress and asked a broken man to dance." Her eyes were filling. "I am not broken," he said, fierce and tender at the same time, the very essence of who he was. "But I was lonely. I was so profoundly lonely that I had stopped recognizing it as loneliness. And then you came, and I remembered what warmth feels like, and I cannot go back to the cold. Pryden, I am a servant. I own nothing. I have no name, no family. You have a name, Cyrilda Emberfield. And it will be Cyrilda Ghostfang, if you will have me. Not because I command it, because I am asking. Because there is no crown or kingdom that means more to me than the way you looked at me that night." She was crying openly now. She had spent her entire life being invisible, and now the most powerful man in the realm was holding her hand and telling her that she was the story. "But I need you to know that I will protect you," he continued, his expression hardening to the sharp protective ferocity that made him the most feared alpha in the north. "Against anyone. The council, the nobles, the world itself. No one will harm you. I swear this on my blood and my name." She looked at him through her tears. This man who was soft as summer rain with her and hard as forged steel with everyone else. The duality was not a contradiction. It was the purest expression of what an alpha was supposed to be. Fierce for the world, gentle for his mate. "I am not afraid," she said. "Not with you. There is more. The council, they are not merely political obstacles. I have begun to suspect some of them are corrupt." "I know," Cyrilda said. He blinked. "What?" She took a breath. "I hear things. Servants are invisible. We move through rooms where powerful men speak freely because they do not consider us worthy of notice. And I have heard things, Pryden." His gray eyes sharpened. The alpha surged, and she could feel the shift in his scent, the change in the air, the garden darkening as his protective fury coiled like a serpent. "Tell me." "Lord Brenshaw and Lord Ironmere. I have heard them speaking late at night. They talk about gold, about diverted treasury funds, about taxes collected from the outer villages that never reach the royal coffers." The silence was not shock. It was a predator locating its prey. "How long?" he asked, dangerously quiet. "Years, from what I have overheard. They have collection agents in the outer villages, men who demand more than the legal tithe and keep the surplus. The villagers are too afraid to protest. They believe it is the crown's will." Pryden pressed both fists against his knees. The tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. A low sound came from his chest. the deep vibration of an alpha whose pack has been betrayed. "They steal from my people," he said, each word a blade. "And they have the audacity to lecture me about duty." There is more. I heard them mention a warehouse near the eastern village of Thornwick. That is where the diverted gold is stored. They mentioned specific collection days, the first and third market days of each month. Pryden looked at her, and something deepened in his estimation. She was not only the woman who had made him feel loved. She was brave and clever, and she had placed herself at risk by listening to conversations that powerful men would kill to keep secret. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am angry. Those villages, the people there have nothing. They live on the edge of starvation, and these lords are stealing from them." He pulled her close, not with restraint, but with the full strength of a man who had found his center. His arm encircled her shoulders, and she fit against his side as if designed for that exact space, her white head resting against his chest. "I will deal with this," he murmured into her hair, "and I will need your help. You have it. Always. Always," he repeated, and it was a vow. The plan came together over the following week, forged in whispered conversations in the garden and late-night meetings in Pryden's study, where the fire burned low and the king and the servant bent over maps like conspirators plotting a revolution, which, in a sense, they were. Pryden could not simply accuse his counselors without proof. Accusations without evidence would be dismissed as paranoia. The court was a delicate ecosystem, and even a king as formidable as Pryden could not afford to move recklessly. Cyrilda was the key. Her invisibility, the very thing that had made her a nobody, was now her greatest weapon. She continued her duties as if nothing had changed, and all the while, her ears were open and her mind was working. She mapped the counselor's movements. She noted when Lord Brenshaw sent private couriers and tracked which servants carried his sealed letters. She befriended the kitchen staff who served Lord Ironmere's personal attendants, and through patient conversation, she learned that Ironmere kept a second ledger, one that never saw the council chamber, locked in a chest in his private quarters. "The ledger is everything," Pryden said one night, pacing his study with restless energy. "If we can get that ledger, we have them. And if we cannot, then we go to Thornwick ourselves. The first market day is in 3 days. If your information is correct, Brenshaw's agents will be there demanding their illegal tithe. I want witnesses, proof that cannot be denied." Cyrilda watched him pace and marveled at the transformation. In the garden, he was tender, a man who held her hand like a prayer. But here, planning the downfall of betrayers, he was the Wolf King, the alpha who had held the walls of Ashen Moor, the commander who had turned the tide of an impossible war. The duality was what made him who he was. The ferocity existed to protect. The steel existed so that the softness could survive. She loved him. She knew it now with a certainty that felt like sunrise, not gradual but sudden and total. Pryden. He stopped pacing and looked at her, and the warrior's intensity softened immediately, like a blade being sheathed at the sound of her voice. "Be careful," she said. "These men are dangerous." He crossed the room to her and lifted his hand to her face. His calloused thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, the gentlest touch, as if she were made of light. "I have faced armies," he said. "I have faced death. But I have never had something worth protecting before. Not like this. That makes me more dangerous than they can possibly imagine." She turned her face into his palm and closed her eyes. "Together, then," she whispered. "Together." But Thornwick was a small village at the kingdom's eastern edge, a cluster of stone cottages and thatched roofs huddled around a muddy market square. The people there were farmers and shepherds who asked nothing of their king except to be left in peace. They were not being left in peace. Pryden and Cyrilda arrived on the morning of the first market day, traveling in an unmarked carriage with Commander Dreven and a contingent of the royal guard in plain clothes. Pryden wore a heavy cloak with the hood pulled forward, though his size made him conspicuous, a dark mountain among villagers who rarely saw anyone taller than their barn doors. The market was modest, wooden stalls selling root vegetables, wool, dried fish. The villagers moved among them with the cautious economy of people who counted every copper. And then the collectors arrived. 4 of them, mounted on horses too fine for a village this size, wearing leather armor stamped with a sigil that was a bastardized version of the royal crest, close enough to claim authority, different enough for deniability. Their leader was a thick-necked man with a scar from temple to jaw, and he rode into the square with casual arrogance. "Tax collection," he announced. "Standard tithe, plus the supplemental defense levy. Every household, no exceptions." The villagers' faces changed. The animation of market day drained away, replaced by gray, resigned fear. An old woman clutching a basket of eggs pressed herself against a wall. A young father stepped in front of his children. The village contracted like a wounded animal. "The supplemental defense levy," Pryden murmured from beneath his hood, and his voice was barely recognizable, something cold and flat and sharp. "There is no supplemental defense levy." "I know," Cyrilda whispered. The collector moved from stall to stall, taking coins and goods with bored efficiency. When a shepherd protested that he had already paid his tithe, the collector backhanded him across the face, and the sound cracked through the square like a whip. Pryden moved. One moment he was beside Cyrilda in the shadow of a doorway, and the next he was striding into the square, his cloak billowing, his crutches striking the cobblestones like a war march. The crowd parted before him instinctively, every instinct recognizing what he was, an alpha at the peak of his authority, radiating a presence so overwhelming that the air thickened around him. He stopped in the center, threw back his hood, and let them see. The villagers gasped, stumbled backward, dropped to their knees. The collectors froze, their faces cycling through recognition, disbelief, and terror. Majesty," the thick-necked collector stammered. The council authorized nothing." Pryden's voice rolled across the square like thunder. "There is no supplemental defense levy. There has never been one. What you are doing is theft, carried out under a false seal, against my people, in my name." Commander Drevin appeared at Pryden's side. Behind him, a dozen soldiers in the king's livery filed into positions that made the word escape sound theoretical. "Arrest them," Pryden said. "All 4. They will answer for their crimes in the dungeon." Within minutes, the collectors were disarmed, bound, and being escorted to the waiting wagon. Pryden turned to the villagers. They were still on their knees, many weeping, not with fear, but with the relief of people who had endured injustice for so long they had stopped believing deliverance was possible. He lowered himself. It was not easy with the crutches, but he did it, extending his hand to the old woman. "Rise," he said, and his voice was gentle now, the tenderness that he guarded like a flame. "You are my people. You should never have had to kneel like this." The old woman took his hand. "Bless you, Majesty. We thought no one knew. We thought no one cared." "I care, and I swear to you this will never happen again." He straightened, and his eyes found Cyrilda across the square. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, her white hair bright against the gray morning, her red dress a spot of color in a muted world, and she was looking at him with pride and love and fierce determination. He smiled at her. A small, private smile meant for no one else. She smiled back. The arrests at Thornwick were only the beginning. Over the following days, Pryden moved with strategic precision. The captured collectors, confronted with the dungeon, were remarkably forthcoming about their employers. The network of corruption was exposed with clinical thoroughness. Lord Ironmere's second ledger was found exactly where Cyrilda had predicted, its contents damning. Column after column of diverted funds, false levies, phantom expenses, a meticulous record of greed stretching back 5 years. Lord Brenshaw's involvement ran deeper. The investigation revealed he had been funneling stolen gold to the Velmorn family through intermediaries, paying for the alliance that would have made the Sara queen. The rejection at the altar had not been spontaneous. It had been orchestrated by Brenshaw after he realized Pryden's interest in Cyrilda threatened his scheme. "He planned the rejection," Pryden said, reading seized correspondence, his voice dangerously quiet. "He told the Sara to refuse me. He used my injury as the justification." Cyrilda sat beside him, her hand on his arm. She could feel the rage vibrating through him, but also the restraint of a man who channeled fury into purpose. "He used your pain as a weapon," she said softly. "For 5 years he sat in my council and ate at my table and called me king, and all the while he was stealing from the people I swore to protect." He turned to look at her. The storm cleared. What remained was resolution and unwavering certainty, but he failed. Because of you. Because of us. No. You. You heard what no one else did, because no one else was listening. You changed everything, Cyrilda. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, and his arm came around her with instinctive gentleness. "Then let us finish it," she said. The arrests of Lord Brenshaw and Lord Ironmere were carried out at dawn, before the court had risen. Commander Drevin personally led the guard units that seized both men from their chambers, and the looks on their faces as they were dragged in their nightclothes through the corridors of the keep they had treated as their personal treasury were, by all accounts, immensely satisfying. 3 other counselors were found to have varying degrees of involvement. Lord Voss had actively participated. Lords Terran and Gale had known, but remained silent. They all went to the dungeon. The trials were swift but thorough. Pryden insisted on transparency, opening the proceedings to the public. The evidence was presented, witnesses testified, and the people heard the full scope of the betrayal. The convicted counselors were stripped of titles, lands, and wealth. The stolen gold was to be returned to every village with interest. Lord Brenshaw, whose crimes were the most egregious, was sentenced to permanent imprisonment. Pryden stood at the center of the great hall, the same hall where he had been rejected, where Cyrilda had asked him to dance, and watched justice being done. His face was hard, his eyes carrying the cold fire of an alpha who had been betrayed, and responded not with blind vengeance, but with the devastating application of law. He was magnificent, and Cyrilda, standing in the crowd, had never loved anything so fiercely. The announcement came 3 days later. Pryden had declared a gathering in the great courtyard of Ghostfang Keep, the open-air space at the heart of the fortress where the people had always come to hear their king speak. It was an ancient tradition, a direct line between ruler and ruled. The morning was cold and bright, the sky a hard, brilliant blue. The courtyard filled as word spread. Villagers came from the surrounding settlements. Merchants closed their shops. Soldiers lined the perimeter, and the people of Ghostfang Keep, from the highest remaining nobles to the lowest kitchen apprentices, gathered in the cold, bright air and waited. Cyrilda stood near the back, almost hidden among the servants. She was wearing her red dress, her white hair loose, catching the winter light like freshly fallen snow. She did not know what Pryden was going to say. He had only asked her to be there, and the look in his eyes when he asked had been a blend of determination and vulnerability. She recognized as the expression he wore when he was about to do something that mattered. The courtyard fell silent as Pryden appeared on the raised stone platform. He stood tall, his crutches planted firmly, his black hair bound back, his cloak stirring in the wind. His voice carried across the courtyard with a clarity that needed no amplification. "My people," 2 words spoken with such depth of feeling that they seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone who heard them. "You have been wronged, not by enemies at our borders, but by men who sat in my own council. Men I trusted, who swore to serve the crown, and instead served only themselves. For years these men have stolen from you. They have taken your gold, your grain, and your trust. and they have hidden their crimes behind the authority of the throne. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I did not know. That is not an excuse. It is a failure, my failure, and I own it. A king who does not know what is done in his name is a king who has not been paying close enough attention. He paused, and the silence was absolute. But I know now, because someone had the courage to tell me. Someone who had no obligation to speak, no power to compel action, no position of authority, and who spoke anyway, because it was right. Because the people of this kingdom deserve to be heard, even by the smallest voice among them. His eyes found Serilda across the courtyard. She felt his gaze like sunlight, warm and inescapable. The stolen gold will be returned to every village. The illegal levies are abolished permanently. New oversight will ensure that no one, no matter their rank, can ever again exploit the trust between the crown and the people. A cheer began to build, but Pryden raised his hand, and the sound subsided. There was more. They could feel it. There is one more thing. He turned and looked directly at Serilda. The crowd followed his gaze, 1,000 faces turning toward the girl in the red dress, the Omega servant with the white hair who suddenly found herself at the center of the world. Serilda Emberfield. Her name, spoken by the king, in front of everyone. She could not move. Her heart was pounding so violently she thought it might burst, and the crowd parted around her, creating a path between her and the platform, a corridor of faces looking at her with curiosity and wonder. "Come here," Pryden said, and his voice was soft now, the softness that belonged only to her, audible because every person in the courtyard had stopped breathing. She walked, one foot in front of the other, the red dress moving around her legs like flame, her white hair streaming in the wind, her eyes locked on the man who was watching her approach, with an expression simultaneously the most powerful and the most vulnerable she had ever seen. She reached the platform, climbed the steps, stood before him. Up close, she could see everything. The barely contained emotion in his gray eyes. The slight tremble of his jaw, the only sign that the Alpha King was terrified, not of enemies or battles, but of this moment, this woman, this question. He released one crutch. It clattered against the stone, and with his freed hand, he reached into his cloak and withdrew a ring. It was not grand, not the jewel-encrusted monstrosity that tradition demanded. It was a simple band of dark iron, forged from the same metal as his crutches, set with a single stone the color of embers, warm and red and alive. He had had it made in secret, and the blacksmith later said that the king had stood over his shoulder for the entire process with meticulous attention. "Serilda Emberfield," he said. And every person heard the crack in his voice, the fracture in the composure of the most powerful man in the realm, caused not by pain, but by the overwhelming force of love he could no longer contain. "I have been a king. I have been a warrior. I have been a broken man leaning on iron and pretending it was strength. I have been alone for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be otherwise." His hand shook as he held the ring up. "And then you asked me to dance. In an empty hall, with no music, with no reason except that you saw a man who was hurting and you could not walk away. You changed everything. Not by fixing me, because I was never broken, you said that. And I believe it now because you said it. But by standing beside me and making the standing mean something." Tears fell down her cheeks, catching the light like diamonds on her pale skin. "I do not have pretty words. I am a soldier, not a poet. But I know this. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are near. I want to walk the gardens with you and argue about philosophy and listen to you hum in the dark. I want to spend the rest of my life finding new excuses to be in the same room as you, even though we both know the bookshelves were always perfectly arranged." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, warm and genuine. "Will you marry me? Not as a king commanding a subject, but as a man asking the woman he loves, the woman who taught him that he deserved to be loved, to be his partner, his equal, his queen. 1,000 people. Complete, breathless silence. Serilda looked at the ring. She looked at the man holding it. She looked at his gray eyes, full of storm and fire and gentleness. She looked at the crutches that had never made him less, and the scars that had never made him weak, and the heart he had hidden behind walls of duty and loneliness, until she had found the door and opened it, and found inside a love so vast and tender that it could sustain a kingdom. Yes, she said it once, quiet and certain, and the word was swallowed by the roar. The courtyard erupted. 1,000 voices raised in a cheer that shook the ancient stones, a sound that carried beyond the walls and across the fields and into the mountains. Soldiers banged their shields. Women wept. Children clambered onto their parents' shoulders. But Serilda heard none of it. She heard only Pryden's exhale, the shuddering breath of a man releasing every ounce of fear and hope. She felt his hand sliding the ring onto her finger, the ember stone warm as if it carried its own fire. She felt his arms come around her, pulling her against his chest, and he was shaking. This enormous, powerful, fearsome man was shaking in her arms, and she held him the way she had held him that first night, with a steadiness that came from somewhere deeper than muscle and bone. "I have you," she whispered, and her words were lost in the cheering. But he heard them, because they were meant for him and only him, and they were enough. He kissed her, not a ceremonial kiss, a kiss that forgot the world existed, clumsy and desperate and real, the kind that happens when two people have been circling each other for weeks, building toward a single point of convergence, and finally allow themselves to collide. His hand cupped the back of her head, fingers tangling in her white hair. Her hands fisted in the front of his cloak. The crowd roared, and the wind blew, and the winter sun blazed down on Ghostfang Keep, as if even the sky approved. When they broke apart, breathless and flushed, Pryden rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words rough and unvarnished, spoken not as a declaration, but as a confession, the most honest thing he had ever said. "I know," she whispered. "I have known since you let me hold your hand in the moonlight." He laughed, a real laugh, full and deep, and the sound made her heart feel like it was expanding to fill the entire sky. "And I love you," she added. "I love you, Pryden Ghostfang. All of you. Every part." He closed his eyes. A tear escaped. Just one, tracking down his scarred cheek, and she reached up and touched the place where it had been, and he turned his face into her palm, and they stood like that while the world celebrated around them. The wedding took place on the first day of winter, in the great hall of Ghostfang Keep. It was a very different ceremony from the one that had come before. There were candles, thousands of them, but this time their light was warm and joyful. There were flowers, winter roses and white heather and holly, filling the air with brightness. There were people, not only nobles, but servants and soldiers and villagers from Thornwick and the outer settlements. People invited by name, by a king, who had learned that a kingdom is not its lords and ladies, but its people. Pryden stood at the altar in a black coat trimmed with silver, his hair unbound, his gray eyes fixed on the door with an intensity that made Commander Drevin take a cautious half-step aside. "If you grip those crutches any harder," Drevin murmured, "you are going to snap them." "If you do not stop talking," Pryden replied without moving his eyes, "I am going to snap you." Drevin wisely fell silent. The music began. Not the formal orchestral arrangements of the previous ceremony, but something simpler. A melody played on a wooden flute by a musician from Thornwick, a village folk song about two stars that fell from the sky and found each other in a field of snow. It was the melody Serilda had hummed. The doors opened. She walked in alone. She had no father to give her away, no family to escort her. She walked on her own 2 feet, as she had always done, carrying herself with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a woman who knew exactly who she was. She wore white. Not the white of surrender, but the white of her hair, her skin, the moonlight that had illuminated their first dance, the snow that covered the mountains of the kingdom she was about to help lead. Her dress was simple and elegant, flowing like water, catching the candlelight like captured starlight. Around her neck, she wore a chain of dark iron, matched to the ring on her finger, the ember stone resting against her heart. But her shoes were red, deep, warm, ember red, visible with every step, a flash of fire beneath the snow. Cyrilda Emberfield walked down the aisle of the great hall, and every person in the room felt the world shift. Pryden watched her come. He watched her the way a drowning man watches the shore, the way a soldier watches the dawn after a long night, the way a king watches the thing he has fought and bled and broken himself to protect finally walk toward him, wearing white and red and a smile that could melt mountains. She reached the altar. She stood before him. And this time, when the high priest began the question, it was Pryden who answered first. "Yes," he said, before the words were fully spoken, and the hall erupted in laughter and tears and the warm, chaotic sound of joy. The vows were spoken. The bond was sealed. And when Pryden kissed his bride, the sound that rose from the crowd was not polite ovation, but a roar, a thundering affirmation that carried through the corridors and out into the winter night, and across the snow-covered fields to every corner of the kingdom. And then the king turned to his queen and offered his hand. "Shall we dance?" he asked. Cyrilda took his hand. She took both his hands, and he released the crutches, and they held each other up, swaying in the candlelight, imperfect and beautiful, and absolutely, irrevocably whole. The music played, the people watched, the candles burned. And in the great hall of Ghostfang Keep, where an Alpha King had once stood alone in the darkness, rejected and broken, and believing that love was a story that happened to other people, two unlikely hearts beat as one, and the world was, for one luminous and eternal moment, exactly as it was meant to be. Not a fairy tale, not a song, something better, something real. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.